Like the ghosts of secrets buried deep beneath Michigan soil, the mist clung to the woodland floor. For almost a day, the expansive oaks and towering pines had stood guard over a mystery that would test everything for a century. Historians believe they were aware of bootlegging activities during the Prohibition era, when environmentalists discovered, in October 2024, during routine route maintenance, the first wooden planks emerged from the ground. They were unaware that they were going to unearth one of the most advanced underground networks ever found in the Midwest of America. Decades of rain and snow have worn down the broken door. Glimpses of metal were visible through a skew that hung like a mouth frozen in mid-scream, shining in the shadows outside. What was underneath would change the famed Thomas Red Tom McKinnon's narrative. Bootlegger who disappeared completely on a chilly February night at precisely 100. Several years ago, the archaeological community was rocked by the revelation. Neighborhood and piqued the interest of true crime fans nationwide. Here, concealed beneath layers of the tangled root systems and rotting leaves were proof of a much more complex process than anyone had thought to be feasible. Despite being smaller than myths had claimed, the tunnel network continued for some, connecting several secret compartments that were once home to substantial amounts of illicit alcohol at the height of the ban. However, this clandestine business is more than just a bootlegging operation. Network recounted the tale of a guy who appeared to have disappeared, leaving only rumors and legends in his wake. Things became increasingly complex with every decade that went by. As investigators, the forest itself appeared to hold its breath, started their meticulous excavation. Every corroded piece, every shattered board of metal, each glass bottle piece revealed a bit of the narrative. The door that had initially attracted the workers' interest was only the start. There was a steel doorway beneath it that had managed to survive. The components. Despite the rust on its exterior, it is still intact after all these years. When scientists eventually managed to pry it, a falling staircase dug straight into the bedrock was exposed by their flashlight beams. Every step, polished smooth by many footsteps from a time when the United States had declared war on alcohol, and guys like Red Tom McKinnon had used cunning to fight back. Resolve, as well as a covert operation that defied federal authority in ways that creativity. The tiniest scent was borne by the stale air that emerged from the depths. Ghostly feeling of wood smoke and grain alcohol, as though the tunnels themselves kept in mind the flurry of activity that used to occupy their rooms. Later, investigators would find that the network contained residential quarters, meeting spaces, storage areas, and a distillation chamber. Areas, as well as what looked to be a rudimentary communications facility with telephone equipment relics. The sophistication of the operation, albeit it wasn't as extensive as legend had claimed, showed that Red Tom had been much more than a small-time thief looking to turn a fast buck. During the Prohibition-era, he had been operating what amounted to a covert, well-organized criminal enterprise, would cast doubt on all presumptions regarding rural Michigan's involvement in the illicit alcohol trade. When word of the finding spread, the offspring of families who had been there in the 1920s started sharing tales that had been passed down through the ages. Stories of enigmatic lights shifting across the nighttime forest, of odd noises coming from underground, of men who vanished into the carried bulky things through the woods and came out empty-handed hours later. After being written off for decades as regional folklore, these tales suddenly gained new significance considering what was hidden beneath the forest floor. The finding would not only resolve one of the oldest cases of missing persons in Michigan, but also show the full extent of one man's bold challenge to federal power during one of the most turbulent times in the history of America. Early in the spring of 1917, Thomas McKinnon arrived in northern Michigan, almost 2 years before to the Volstead Act, which would permanently alter American society. At 30 years old, he had the restless energy that, wherever he walked, appeared to sizzle in the air around him, standing just over He was 6 feet tall and had a shock of red hair, which gave him his moniker. Tom Red demanded attention, yet didn't demand it. His Irish ancestry was evident in the sharp angles of his face and the green eyes that appeared to absorb everything without disclosing anything. He was a contradictory man, according to those who knew him. Lovely but reclusive, giving but cunning, devoted to his friends but brutal to all who oppose him. Prior to Prohibition, he was Previously, McKinnon was employed in Colorado as a mining engineer, acquired useful expertise in subterranean excavation and the logistics of transporting items through small areas. When he made the decision to go into bootlegging, this knowledge would come in very handy. However, in 1917, he was just another young man seeking a new beginning in an area full of opportunities. He bought a small farm. Utilizing funds he said he had saved from his mining job on the outside of Traverse City, while several believed his money came from less reputable sources. The land comprised more than 100 acres of dense forest. Much of it is regarded as marginal by local standards because of the challenging terrain and rocky soil. McKinnon regarded what others perceived as a problem as the ideal cover for his next schemes. The change started throughout a period of 2.5 years, methodically and slowly. McKinnon employed local workers to assist in what he called improvements to his property, paying reasonable pay for labor that appeared strangely covert. Employees were recruited for particular jobs and hardly ever seen the entire extent of the process. Some dug what they believed to be roots, drainage systems, or vendors. Others brought in goods and equipment without understanding their eventual use. Even so, others engaged in what seemed to be traditional farming tasks above ground, offering the ideal cover for. Below, a construction job is underway. Because of his personality, McKinnon, perfect for a project like this. He was able to read people almost supernaturally, knowing. He knew instantly who he should avoid and whom he might trust. Locals felt there was more to their new neighbor than first met the eye, but they still thought he was likable enough. He routinely attended church while in town, made contributions to local causes, and had cordial ties with his neighbors without ever giving away too much about his history or intentions. This well-developed public image would be crucial to his business. Evolved in the summer and fall of 1919 as a nationwide discussion regarding. McKinnon expedited his preparations as Prohibition grew more severe. He recognized that the impending alcohol prohibition would present tremendous opportunity for those prepared to take the dangers associated with illicit production and distribution. However, other possible. He was already building the infrastructure as bootleggers continued to argue over whether the legislation would be enforced. Need to profit from the enormous demand for illicit booze that he accurately forecast. His underground facility required a great deal of skill and meticulous planning, working mostly at night, and when it seemed unlikely that inquisitive neighbors would notice what he was doing, McKinnon and a small group of a system of chambers connected by tunnels was progressively excavated by dependable workers, etched straight into the substrate of granite beneath his land. The task was hazardous and backbreaking, involving the removal of tons of earth and rock. Things needed to be disposed of discreetly. The main tunnel was about 200 yards away from his farmhouse basement into the forest, with other smaller branches that lead to different places of use. The engineering was good, if not outstanding, and made use of McKinnon's experience in mining to guarantee structural stability without sacrificing confidentiality. There was ventilation through neatly hidden shafts that, from above, seemed like natural features. A tiny electrical system. The subterranean spaces were illuminated by wires that were buried and connected to the main home. By the time McKinnon was prepared for the official start of Prohibition in January 1920, as potential bootleggers rushed to set up supply routes and locate safe storage spaces, he had already spent months honing an operation that, albeit being more modest than later legends would imply, was still tremendously advanced for its location and era. One of the key distillation areas in his underground network had a single, superior copper still, storage spaces large enough to hold several hundred gallons of final product, and simple, living spaces that, if needed, could accommodate 4 to 6 men. What distinguished McKinnon from other bootleggers was the caliber of his output as well as the preparation that went into his business. While a lot of illicit distillers took costs to increase profits, frequently creating alcohol that was hazardous to drink, McKinnon insisted on reasonable standards. Through reputable agricultural ties, he acquired high-quality grain and employed a skilled distiller who, before to Prohibition, had worked in lawful enterprises and made investments in machinery that produced alcohol that was secure and comparatively seamless. Word of mouth among the expanding network spread his reputation for excellence, of private clubs and speakeasies that have proliferated throughout the area. Because of his business's success, McKinnon was able to grow his clientele beyond the local distribution. He established connections with a network that included distributors in Detroit, suppliers in Canada, and Chicago, handling connections with other criminal groups and organizing shipments. His subterranean structure, which offered safe processing and storage facilities, was an essential link in this system for alcohol intended for Midwestern markets. The earnings were significant, enabling him to keep enhancing his business and growing his clout in the regional criminal underbelly. But there was risk associated with achievement. Federal agents, by 1923, were fully aware that a major bootlegging operation was being handled by someone in northern Michigan, even if they had. McKinnon has not yet been designated as their target. His associates' loyalty and his meticulous security procedures had shielded him up to this point, but the pressure was growing. Additionally, rival crime groups were paying attention, perceiving his accomplishment as a threat as well as an opportunity. The stage was being prepared for a conflict that would eventually cause him to vanish and the underground to be abandoned. Operation that he had put a lot of effort into creating. Tom McKinnon was read by those who knew. Described a man who appeared to be more conscious of the passing of time during his last months. He had consistently been cautious, but his security measures grew nearly compulsive as 1924 got underway. He changed up his routine and had less faith in sensitive individuals' knowledge and started making plans that implied he was getting ready for a protracted leave or worse. Although he never disclosed them, some of his employees said that he had indicated having backup plans in place. The specifics of these arrangements. The man, who had before appeared self-assured and in command, was starting to exhibit. Despite the tremendous strain of operating a criminal business while keeping one step ahead of both the law enforcement and competing offenders, his lifestyle of seclusion had started to weigh heavily on him as well. Living under a false name all the time, keeping up complex lies about his actions, and believing that no one had ever taken psychiatric, told that others who knew him well were starting to notice more and more. He was having no close personal ties outside of his criminal colleagues and no familial ties that may offer mental support, as well as no acceptable social activities that could have provided a break from the ongoing stress of his illicit actions. Additionally, McKinnon had started to think that someone in his own company might be giving his adversaries information. Minor discrepancies in reports from his colleagues, small security lapses that were difficult to explain, and he had been persuaded that betrayal was due to small behavioral changes in men he had previously trusted unconditionally. Imminent. Although the situation may have justified his worry, it was making it more and more challenging for him to lead and make decisions. February 15th, 1924. Northern Michigan saw a beautiful and fresh sunrise with temps slightly below freezing and a little dusting of. The ground is covered in snow. It started out just like any other day for Thomas McKinnon, what had developed into a meticulously planned regimen intended to uphold the appearance of lawful farming while supervising his business of bootlegging. As was customary, he got up before daylight and spent the early morning hours going over production-level reports from his exclusive set of reliable colleagues, distribution schedules, and security issues. The subterranean complex operated on a smaller scale than subsequent stories would imply, but it nevertheless needed ongoing maintenance to preserve both secrecy and productivity. The initial sign that this day will. During his routine morning inspection of the property's perimeter, something was odd. This tour was made by McKinnon. Every day, purportedly monitoring his legal farming activities, but in reality, closely scrutinizing the hidden indicators of the state of his clandestine operations. This morning in particular, he observed that there was a faint signal left by one of his lookouts that suggested there might be surveillance nearby. The signal itself wasn't startling right away. Local police officers and federal authorities have been more prevalent in the area recently. Months, but he was extremely worried by the timing and place. His intuition, sharpened by years of living on the brink of discovery, informed him that today was not like the ordinary law patrols by law police that were now typical in the region. The activity he engaged in had a greater sense of purpose, was watching, a sign that his adversaries might be getting closer to his operation at last. The careful equilibrium, the balance between operational necessity and care that had kept him safe for so long was starting to change in ways that caused him more and more discomfort. McKinnon had assembled his tiny inner circle by mid-morning 4. Deep beneath the forest floor, in the main room, there was an emergency meeting. The room was equipped and cut out of solid rock, featuring basic yet useful furnishings that had been lowered through secret passageways acting as the hub for his whole process. The 4 men who gathered there stood for the most reliable and competent members of his organization. Each was in charge of a distinct facet of the operations that maintained illicit booze flowing to clients throughout the area from his distillery. The conversation the focus of the morning was on intelligence reports indicating that federal officers were preparing a significant operation in the region. Local law enforcement sources had warned McKinnon of heightened activities, but the information was, well, fragmented and challenging to understand. A few of his colleagues urged quick action to protect the most precious inventory and get ready for a potential raid. Others contended that the hasty actions could actually draw unwelcome attention, and the threat could be aimed at rival companies. They all knew that sound could pass through the rock walls, so the heated discussion was held in whispers. Access different areas of the facility. Before making his choice, McKinnon thoroughly considered all points of view, balancing the hazards of taking action against the perils of doing nothing. His years of experience had shown him that reacting too quickly to dangers may be just as risky as ignoring actual risks. The difficulty of continuing to operate without being discovered needed to make frequent decisions that balanced a variety of conflicting considerations, and he had made more wise choices than bad ones to get this far. Instead of directing a shutdown or evacuation right away, McKinnon opted for a middle ground that demonstrated his awareness of the risks involved as well as his trust in his security measures. He directed his lookouts to be more watchful, expedited the delivery of completed inventory to safe locations. That triggered a number of backup procedures created for precisely this kind of circumstance. Above all, he chose to personally supervise a shipment that was set to depart that evening, thinking that his direct participation would guarantee that everything went without a hitch during this potentially hazardous time. The afternoon was spent meticulously getting ready for the operation that night. The package included about 50 gallons of high-end whiskey headed for speak-easies in Detroit, signifying one of the. In recent months, McKinnon had tried to move larger, single consignments. The complicated logistics involved numerous cars, numerous routes, and meticulous coordination with distributors who would manage the final delivery. McKinnon personally examined each component of the setup, including the product's quality to the dependability of the trucks used to convey it. As night fell, within its inevitably constrained scope, regular activity in the subterranean complex increased. Employees relocated efficiently through the tunnels, packing bottle cases into carts that would deliver them to. There are secret exits all across his land. The primary distillation process was briefly halted. It's fire-banked, but prepared to start up again as soon as the shipment was securely removed. Security guards took up posts at all of the main entry points, prepared to issue a warning if rival criminals or police enforcement attempted to obstruct the process. McKinnon personally made the last arrangements. Deep into the complex, in his personal rooms, the tiny space scooped out of rock, such as his personal belongings and the paperwork required to arrange his different commercial endeavors. Wearing dark clothes appropriate for navigating the woodland at night, he examined the weapons he always carried during risky operations and went over the comprehensive strategies that would direct the events of the evening. He appeared composed, but extremely agitated, according to those who observed him during these last hours, demonstrating none of his usual assurance. Shortly after dusk, the shipment started to move with the first vehicle leaving via a hidden exit while McKinnon stayed underground, organizing the entire operation. For the first few hours, everything went as planned, with frequent check-ins from his drivers attesting to the fact that they were moving along their assigned routes with good speed. The underground facility gradually resumed its regular nightly schedule once the majority of the merchandise was successfully relocated to safe staging locations. It was getting close to midnight when McKinnon eventually came out of the underground to personally handle what he had told his associates was a last delivery. Things needed his immediate attention. This concerned a smaller, high-value shipment that he had chosen to personally oversee, in part because of security concerns and in part because the purchasers were significant contacts whose connections he favored managing directly. He got together with two of his most trusted associates at one of the secret exits, went over the last elements of their plan, and then departed into the carrying a leather backpack, which witnesses would later describe as small but seemingly heavy, across a dark woodland. The trio men avoided the main highways, where they might have encountered danger, and instead followed a trail that meandered through the densest area of the forest. Come across patrols of law enforcement. The route had been utilized numerous times without any problems, and McKinnon was acquainted with each turn and bend in the path. Since dusk, the temperature had decreased by several degrees, and as they moved through the snow-covered undergrowth, their breath created visible clouds in the chilly air. Understanding that sound traveled far in the silent night air, none of them spoke during the trip, and that their being unnoticed was essential to safety. They had gone about a mile and a half from the secret exit. McKinnon abruptly came to a stop, raising his hand to signal his friends to stop. Right away, the three men stayed motionless and listened for a long while, paying close attention to the sounds of the surrounding woodland. His colleagues would later claim to have heard nothing strange, but McKinnon seemed certain that something wasn't right. The woodland, which ought to have been filled with the typical nocturnal animal sounds, appeared unusually silent, as if the night's natural rhythm has been upset by presences. Because of his years of experience, McKinnon had learned to trust his intuition, even when reason indicated that his worries might not be justified. He had avoided many near misses by observing small clues that others could have overlooked it, but there was something about this specific evening that felt different from their earlier travels. Through the woodland, the unprecedented activity of law enforcement during the day, along with his mounting concerns of organizational disloyalty, had made him extremely vigilant for any indication of peril. He gave his friends quick instructions in a whisper, urging them to keep going to the meeting place, while he looked into what had piqued his interest. Later, his colleagues remembered that he appeared abnormally disturbed, more worried about the possible danger than they had ever encountered him in their earlier operations. Collectively, he deviated from his usual security procedures by choosing to split ways with his friends, which consistently stressed sticking together in potentially hazardous circumstances. Thomas McKinnon would not be seen alive again after this. His two associates were waiting at the scheduled meeting place for more than an hour, before concluding that a major issue had arisen. They went back to the location where they had last seen him, but they couldn't find their leader or any clue as to what might have happened. To him, he had lost the bag he had been carrying, and there were no indications of a battle or any other disruption that could account for his abrupt vanishing into the icy night. The woodland appeared to have engulfed him entirely, leaving only unanswered questions and a mystery that would persist for precisely 100 years. The meticulous preparations he had made, the advanced system he had constructed, and the backup plans he had made turned out to be ineffective against whatever had happened to him during those last moments in the shadowy forest. Throughout the night, his associates frantically looked for him, calling his name in hoarse murmurs and searching every shadow that could have hidden his body, but nothing was visible in the forest. The search, which started right away and lasted for days, would find nothing. Hints about McKinnon's destiny. It was as though he had just disappeared, leaving only a clandestine organization that, in the absence of his direction and leadership, would quickly fall apart. For precisely a century, the mystery surrounding what transpired in those last moments in the shadowy forest would persist until finding his secret tunnels revealed additional details about his remarkable life, and Red Tom McKinnon's enigmatic disappearance. When Thomas McKinnon did not come back, his meticulously planned criminal scheme started with his nocturnal rendezvous, initial tentative steps in the disintegration process. The two co-workers who had seen him vanish went back to the subterranean facility early on February 16th. According to their research, shockwaves were sent via an organization that had never considered operating without its resolute head. In a few hours, word of Mackenzie's. Every level of the operation had been affected by the disappearance, starting with the workers who maintained the distillation apparatus, from the lookouts positioned around the surrounding forest to the tunnels. The organization of McKinnon's operation and its eventual reliance on his own decision-making and leadership skills. Patrick, a previous mining co-worker, served as his lieutenant. After joining McKinnon in Michigan in the early days of Prohibition, O'Sullivan assumed command of the emergency procedures designed specifically for this kind of situation. The subterranean structure was put on high alert, with all non-essential people removed, the most precious equipment removed, and inventory was relocated to safe backup sites that McKinnon had set up in case of an emergency. The primary distillation operations were entirely suspended, flames were put out, and equipment was carefully hidden to remove any proof of recent activity. The methodical approach to the emergency protocols showed the degree of plans that McKinnon had made in order to be ready for any eventuality. Despite the fact that none had expected their leader to be the fatality that set off these procedures, the effectiveness with which his colleagues carried out these processes also demonstrated the caliber of his staff, hired and prepared for his enterprise. Local law enforcement organizations were unexpectedly delayed to discover McKinnon's absence, in part due to the necessity of his organization's secrecy, in part because individuals who would have filed a missing persons report had strong reasons of their own to stay away. With the authorities, the bootlegger had taken care to keep up his disguise as a calm farmer and as illegal. Employees realized that enlisting the help of law police to find their missing leader could put them all at risk of prosecution. Not until February 20th, almost 5 days after his disappearance, did Sheriff. The first formal report on a missing person that fit McKinnon's description was sent to Robert Coleman. Even then, worried neighbors who had observed that no one was reporting him did so instead of his criminal partners had been spotted for a few days around the McKinnon farm. The farmer, who was nearest to McKinnon's property, had become concerned when he saw no chimney smoke and other indications of typical regular activity in the vicinity of the structures. His worries were sincere, yet they were totally on McKinnon's meticulously crafted public image as a respectable farmer who kept up regular routines and engaged in typical social contacts with his neighbors. Initially, Sheriff Coleman, the same elements that had shielded McKinnon's business throughout its history also hindered the investigation. The bootlegger had developed a reputation as a peaceful, law-abiding farmer, and there is nothing in his public persona that would indicate criminal behavior or the types of adversaries who could want to harm him. The property seemed to be just what it said it was, a small farming. Operate in a rural area with no indications of recent disturbances or odd activities. No overt indications of foul play were discovered by the sheriff and his officers. No clue as to where McKinnon might have disappeared, and there were no witnesses who could shed light on his activities or whereabouts. His farmhouse was tidy and peaceful, with no indications of a violent conflict or hurried escape. Individual items were still in their usual locations, and there was no proof that McKinnon had packed for a trip or ready to depart permanently. The scene implied that he had just abandoned his usual regimen and failed to go back, leaving no indication of where he was going or what his goals were. In the beginning, the response was more extensive but equally ineffective. For months, bootlegging activity in the area had been monitored by Prohibition agents, and McKinnon's name had surfaced in a number of intelligence assessments as a person of interest whose actions called for further investigation. Federal authorities began their own inquiry after learning of his abduction, believing that his vanishing could be linked to criminal behavior that was under their authority. Teams of federal agents searched the woodland surrounding his property, asked locals what they knew about McKinnon and his operations, and looked through his financial documents for hints on his commercial connections and possible connections to illegal activity. The inquiry was comprehensive and professional, employing the most effective methods known to law enforcement in 1924. However, it was unable to reveal the meticulously hidden proof of McKinnon's actual actions. What the investigators discovered was a masterwork of deception and meticulous preparation that had taken years to create. McKinnon's authentic. His little riches could be explained by his farming efforts, and his bank records revealed no clear ties to illicit activities or dubious trades. There were signs of regular agricultural activities on his farm, suitable for the time of year, and the structures held nothing more dubious than standard farming supplies and equipment that any respectable farmer may have possessed. Even beyond what his public persona suggested, his personal belongings showed very nothing about the guy. Investigators discovered equipment, correspondence with reputable vendors, and books on farming and agricultural methods, producers and personal goods that depicted a calm bachelor leading a modest country life. There were no communication with known criminals, no firearms beyond what might be anticipated for lawful hunting and pest management, and no proof of the money that successful bootlegging could have brought in. The subterranean structure that represented his actual accomplishment, which the investigators were unable to discover despite their extensive search of his belongings. The hidden entrances were made to endure precisely this kind of examination, fitting in perfectly with the surrounding environment, and displaying no indications of recent construction or frequent use. The advanced ventilation systems that had permitted his distillation processes to operate covertly now served to conceal even the smallest hint of the actions that had occurred underground. The few men who were aware of the secret entrances' locations had either left the area as soon as McKinnon vanished or continued to complete silence when detectives questioned them about their presence. Their devotion to their absent boss, paired with their knowledge that they would face severe criminal charges if they disclosed the operation, made sure the secret was secure even in the face of government inquiry. To the irate investigators, it seemed that Thomas McKinnon had simply disappeared, leaving no trace of criminal behavior or affiliation with illicit businesses. As days stretched into weeks and the probe made no headway, various theories about the missing man's possible fate started to surface. Some detectives believed he had been killed by competing criminals, most likely during an intensified territory battle or economic dispute. Beyond compromise, some thought he might have engineered his own abduction, possibly after being informed of an upcoming law enforcement action that could have led to his arrest and prosecution. Some investigators even speculated that he may have been murdered by his own colleagues, either in an internal power struggle or fight, or, if he had been apprehended, to keep him from assisting the authorities. This theory received some credence when detectives discovered that a number of guys who had been employed by McKinnon had moved away soon after his absence, despite the lack of proof linking their departures to any illegal action. The most enduring theory, which would ultimately turn out to be the most accurate, was that McKinnon had been the target of a well-planned ambush by those who were familiar with his routines and tendencies. In light of this situation, after learning of his late-night activities, competing criminals or dishonest law enforcement authorities made plans to intercept him while he's traveling through the woodland. The total lack of tangible proof was clarified by because to their meticulous preparation and deep familiarity with the area, the culprits were able to dispose of McKinnon as well as any proof of their crime, leaving no trace for detectives to follow. Throughout the spring and summer of 1924, the investigation persisted, and McKinnon's criminal organization progressively disintegrated and scattered. Without his organizing and leadership abilities, his operation's numerous parts were unable to continue working together and efficiently. A few of his past associates tried to carry on with much smaller-scale operations, but they lacked the resources and the knowledge required to keep up the systems McKinnon had created over a number of years of meticulous design and expansion over time. Others completely left the neighborhood out of concern that their relationship may eventually come under the scrutiny of law enforcement in relation to the missing bootlegger. As the investigation went on, the network of contacts and commercial ties that McKinnon, which had been carefully cultivated over several years, started to crumble as his enemies moved to fill the void created by his withdrawal, while his allies dispersed. The few personnel who were aware of the underground complex's existence carefully sealed it off and left it place. The primary entrances were carefully hidden using methods that McKinnon himself had created to conceal the facility from onlookers. His previous associates either took away valuable equipment or concealed it so well that it would stay undetected for many years. Once home to an operational criminal enterprise, the tunnels collapsed. Silence, gradually starting the lengthy process of deterioration that would ultimately hide the majority of evidence of the amazing operation they had carried out. By the conclusion, the official inquiry into Thomas McKinnon's disappearance in 1924 had been suspended because there was insufficient proof and good leads to follow up on. Coleman, the sheriff, submitted a final report in which they concluded that McKinnon had probably been the victim of foul play, but they acknowledged that there was not enough evidence to identify suspects or file criminal charges. Federal agents came to comparable conclusions, but they continued to harbor doubts about McKinnon's potential role in bootlegging actions, even in the absence of evidence. The case was active, but never officially closed. Investigations came to an end, and McKinnon became one of the many missing people whose fates would never be known to the government. Occasionally, his name would come up in law enforcement reports during the ensuing years, typically in relation to other bootlegging investigations. However, no fresh information would surface to clarify his final destiny or the circumstances behind his disappearance. For precisely a century, the mystery surrounding Red Tom McKinnon's disappearance would persist, becoming a part of local folklore and generating a plethora of interpretations regarding what actually transpired in those last moments in the dark forest. On cold evenings, some people reported seeing his spirit prowling the woods while still holding his gun satchel and looking for the unfulfilled rendezvous. Others maintained that he had managed to flee to Canada or Mexico, where he lived out his days with a false identity, away from the location of his illegal actions. However, until his covert operation was uncovered in 2024, there was no tangible proof to back up any of these claims or to offer Conclusive information regarding the fate of the most successful and mysterious bootlegger in northern Michigan. The Woodland had maintained, kept secrets safe for 100 years, awaiting the fortuitous revelation that would ultimately expose the truth about his remarkable life and enigmatic demise. Thomas's subsequent decades. Following McKinnon's abduction, northern Michigan became a popular tourist destination instead of a rural frontier area. However, the enigma surrounding the missing bootlegger was still fascinating to every new generation that came upon the tale. Local historians gathered incomplete narratives from elderly locals who said they remembered McKinnon or his actions, but the veracity of these recollections became. As the years went by and the stories became more complex to convey, they became more dubious. Throughout the 1930s, when the region was hit by the Great Depression and Prohibition was eventually lifted, some of McKinnon's old colleagues started speaking more candidly once the 21st Amendment was ratified about their bootlegging-era experiences. When the illicit alcohol trade ceased, the tales of McKinnon's riches were tainted by economic difficulties and the threat of prosecution for their previous actions, especially appealed to low-income people who recalled the 1920s as a period of increased opportunity. These stories were told over kitchen tables and in bars throughout the region, offered enticing views of the once thriving enterprise beneath the ground of the forest. The descriptions used by former employees to describe the underground chambers were almost too amazing to think about. Speaking of solid rock tunnels, distillation apparatus that was comparable to items discovered in reputable breweries and storage spaces that had contained illicit goods valued at thousands of dollars. Alcohol at the height of the ban. Patrick provided one of the most thorough and reliable accounts. McKinnon's erstwhile lieutenant, O'Sullivan, had escaped to Canada as soon as his leader's disappearance, but returned to Michigan in 1936 because of financial need exceeded his worries about possible legal repercussions. Interviews with a local newspaper. During the Great Depression, reporters were ravenous for colorful stories. O'Sullivan used precise and consistent language to describe the subterranean structure, yet he portrayed the operation as it was a little bigger and more advanced than it had been. The public was captivated by O'Sullivan's descriptions, and many listeners were persuaded of their fundamental veracity. Yet, he adamantly refused to divulge the locations of the secret entrances or any other information that might have resulted in their discovery. He asserted that McKinnon had vowed to keep the location of the facility a secret from all of his associates, and that even after their commander passed away, this oath was still enforceable. When reporters and treasure seekers demanded, O'Sullivan would only state that the entrances were dispersed around the woodland and so cleverly hidden that they might never be discovered without precise blueprints that had perished alongside McKinnon. Corroborating testimony from other former colleagues filled in more information on the operation while cautiously avoiding any details that could have jeopardized the security of the concealed complex. They detailed the security precautions McKinnon had put in place, such as a network of lookouts who could use signals that seemed informal to convey warnings throughout the organization. Observers as organic elements of the woodland environment. They discussed the quality of the whiskey made in the underground distillery, outlining the procedures McKinnon had followed to guarantee that his goods were safer to drink and better than a lot of the hazardous alcohol that other bootleggers supplied to unsuspecting clients. Treasure seekers and amateurs were drawn to these tales. Archaeologists who devoted a significant amount of time and energy to looking for proof of McKinnon's fabled operation. Equipped with shovels, metal detectors, and replicas of antique maps, they searched through, searching thousands of acres for buried equipment, secret entrances, or any other tangible evidence of the subterranean. Intricate. Some reported discovering questionable indentations in the earth, or uncommon rock forms that could indicate tunnel entrances, but none of these findings resulted in real access to the secret passageways. These amateur endeavors were of little interest to professional archaeologists, in part because they questioned the veracity of the progressively complex accounts regarding McKinnon's operation, in part because they had more important and worthwhile scientific projects to work on. The few scholars who, after looking into the legend, it was determined that although McKinnon had likely engaged in some degree of bootlegging, however, the accounts of his underground dominion were probably much overstated. Actuality, they noted that such structure would have presented huge engineering hurdles, particularly for a criminal enterprise that required complete concealment while utilizing mostly unskilled labor and scarce resources. The logistics of digging up and getting rid of tons of rock and soil, setting up electrical and ventilation systems, and organizing. Given the technology, it appeared impossible for dozens of personnel to carry out their tasks without drawing attention. Resources in rural Michigan in the 1920s. New developments brought about by World War II. Region and momentarily distracted people from the McKinnon mystery as the country concentrated on more pressing worries. Large-scale logging resulted from the need for lumber from the northern Michigan forest brought on by the war effort. Operations that destroyed numerous locations favored by treasure hunters and drastically changed the landscape. To direct their searches, some optimistic people think that this significant earth-moving activity could uncover buried portals to McKinnon's tunnels, but the extensive harvesting only made those people more irritated. Who kept believing in the myth? The 1950s post-war economic boom and 1960s saw a rise in visitors to northern Michigan, attracted by the area's leisure options and scenic splendor, which have been mainly unavailable throughout the years of war and misery. The McKinnon tale was first mentioned by tour guides in their presentations, typically highlighting its enigmatic and romantic elements, while minimizing the criminal aspects that could deter family travelers from visiting the region. Gift shops sold numerous eateries and lodges, as well as publications and booklets about the fabled bootlegger acquired names and themes that mentioned his alleged actions. The narrative was incorporated into the marketing identity of the area, drawing tourists who wanted to feel a connection to the vibrant heritage of the Prohibition-era. Regional celebrations and McKinnon's status and local legend was further cemented when events started embracing his themes. In the 1970s, a resurgence of interest in local genealogy and history prompted more methodical attempts to record the McKinnon narrative and distinguish between creative fiction and proven facts. Elderly people were interviewed by local historical society researchers. Locals who stated they knew McKinnon or his accomplices personally documented their statements on audio recording and made every effort to confirm specifics using official documents and current records that had been preserved in several archives. These initiatives resulted in a more realistic and comprehensive portrait of McKinnon as a person, demonstrating that he had participated in bootlegging operations and had run his business from his property to the north of Traverse City. But the study also demonstrated the extent to which the mythology had expanded beyond historical facts with subsequent narratives, attributing to McKinnon accomplishments and experiences that were either wholly made up or obviously belonged to other bootleggers. The advancement of more advanced archaeological methods in the 1980s and 1990s gave rise to increased expectations among individuals who maintained their belief in the subterranean complex. Penetrating the ground. With the use of radar and other distance sensing technology, buried constructions could be found without the requirement for costly and possibly damaging excavation. Numerous surveys were been out in regions where McKinnon's tunnels may be, according to local customs, yet none of these sophisticated searches provided conclusive proof of subterranean construction or verified the presence of the fabled facility. The McKinnon enigma had become deeply ingrained in local culture and tourism by the end of the 20th century. Promotion while stubbornly refusing to be resolved by traditional investigative techniques. The numerous books about Michigan history and unsolved mysteries featured the narrative, was highlighted in television documentaries on criminals from the Prohibition era, and it served as an inspiration for authors of fiction who exploited the folklore as the inspiration for books and screenplays that further obfuscated the distinction between historical reality and imaginative creativity. Every retelling enriched the narrative with fresh details, making it's getting harder to tell the difference between historical reality and artistic adornment. The real McKinnon who had lived and died was very different from the McKinnon of popular culture in northern Michigan, but the legendary version had developed a life of its own that appeared unrelated to any link to historical fact. In 2024, McKinnon's disappearance will mark its centennial, sparked new attempts to use contemporary investigative techniques to unravel the enigma and attracted increased media attention. Methods. Retrospective stories regarding the case were published in local newspapers. On television, special shows about unsolved crimes during the Prohibition era were created by stations. In online discussion boards, theories about what might have happened to the fabled bootlegger on his last night in the bush were rife. Some investigators tried to examine old photos and papers using new technology in an effort to find hints suggesting it's possible that earlier generations missed it or lacked the resources necessary for its interpretation. Others concentrated on genealogy investigation in an effort to identify McKinnon's known associates' descendants who may have family records or oral traditions that might shed new light on the mystery. In this environment of rekindled curiosity and research, the conservationists made their significant finding in October 2024, the shattered wooden door sticking up from. The workers themselves initially disregarded the forest floor as trash from an old storage building or hunting hut. However, a thorough investigation showed construction methods and materials that were obviously considerably older and commensurate with 1920 craftsmanship, compared to standard hunting shelters. More significantly, the door's position closely matched regions that had been noted as potential locations for McKinnon's secret entrances in historical records. The finding site was located deep within, some 3 miles from McKinnon's farm, the wooded region where his associates claimed to have lost communication with him the night he vanished. The close proximity to these historically important sites, together with the seeming age and high caliber of building of the door, implying that this finding would at last yield the tangible proof that had escaped investigators. For precisely 100 years, the finding would turn out to be the secret that ultimately revealed a secret that has long captivated people's attention, offering tangible proof for tales that were long written up as folklore and demonstrating that, despite possibly not being as detailed as the most spectacular rumors implied, the truth of Red Tom McKinnon was still considerably more remarkable than the majority of doubters had been prepared to accept. The subterranean structure that many of the stories told by guys like Patrick would be confirmed by a long-awaited find beneath the forest floor. O'Sullivan and show that McKinnon had produced something truly exceptional. Over his brief but intensive career as the most successful bootlegger in northern Michigan. On October 23, 2024, the wooden door was first found sticking out of the woodland floor. Occurred as a result of the kind of lucky coincidence that archaeologists fantasize about but hardly encounter in their occupations in the workforce. Michael and Sarah Chun, 2 conservation workers. Rodriguez was tasked with removing fallen trees from a well-traveled hiking path. It had sustained damage from strong storms the previous spring. Used heavy machinery and chainsaws to remove rubble that had built up during several months of disregard. Rodriguez was pushing aside a large fallen oak tree with a tiny bulldozer when the blade of the vehicle seized on what first seemed to be a sizable chunk of buried timber that had been left over from earlier logging activities in the region. Considering that it was, he tried to throw it aside, thinking it was just another piece of storm debris that needed to be removed off the path corridor. Using the bulldozer, but it appeared to be securely rooted in the ground and would not move in spite of the machine's significant power. They soon discovered that when Chun arrived to look into the impediment, instead of haphazard rubble, they discovered a well-made wooden door that had been buried beneath natural dirt, fallen leaves, and decades' worth of collected forest litter. Deposition. Compared to usual storm damage, the door seemed considerably older and displayed constructing methods that didn't seem to fit with contemporary building approaches. The door itself was an amazing work of art that had managed to endure almost a century of interment in Michigan's difficult climate. Constructed from substantial oak planks secured with iron fasteners it was around 4 feet broad by 6 feet tall, corroded but still structurally intact. Feet tall, the wood was clearly weathered and aged with although some of the planks broke or partially rotted, the overall construction was still easily identifiable as a door, created with extensive use and high security in mind. Most interestingly, the doors seemed to have been incorporated into a bigger structure, with hefty iron hinges still fastened to what appeared to be a sturdy timber framework that reached well into the ground. The building implied that this was a useful door rather than just a door that had been thrown into the wild. Entryway that was purposefully disguised and stayed that way until the latest storm activity changed. Sufficient dirt to reveal its upper edges. Chun, a former student of archaeology, before deciding to pursue a profession in environmental conservation, the undergraduate saw the possibilities. The discovery's historical significance. The building methods and supplies were completely uniform. Excellent craftsmanship from the early 20th century, and the setting closely matched historical narratives she had studied. When researching local history, she learned about the McKinnon mystery. The seeming age of the door, combined with, due to its large size and the fact that it is situated in a region where bootlegging is said to have occurred, implied that this could be the find that treasure seekers and historians have been looking for decades. She persuaded Rodriguez to temporarily stop their clearing operations while she got in touch with the local authorities and officials in charge of historical preservation about what they discovered, realizing that further damaging the site without appropriate archaeological monitoring could harm historically significant artifacts or eliminate important evidence. Her experience in academic archaeology had taught her the value of accurate documentation and expert supervision when it comes to potentially important historical findings. The first reaction from local authorities was cautious yet professional, reflecting decades of dealing with treasure hunters' false alarms and amateur archaeologists. Patricia Williams, the sheriff, was related to the original. McKinnon arrived at the site in a matter of hours, thanks to her grandfather's 1920s deputy service of answering Chen's phone. Numerous reports have been received by her department over the years from people claiming to have discovered proof of McKinnon's subterranean compound. Additionally, the majority of these discoveries were shown to be little more than storm shelters, outdated root vendors, or other unremarkable buildings, unrelated to the renowned bootlegger. But Sheriff Williams had sufficient experience to understand that this discovery differed significantly from the typical false alarms that went over her desk. The door's placement and structure suggested that it was genuinely historical in antiquity. It seemed extremely improbable to be associated with any authentic historical activity in such a distant part of the forest, would have departed from traditional record-keeping. More crucially, thorough analysis showed that the door was a component of a structure that was obviously not just buried in the earth, stretched beneath the surface. When deputies peered through holes in the decayed planks with strong flashlights, they could see that the entrance led to what seemed like a staircase that descended into total darkness. The staircase seems to have been built right into the rock foundation beneath the forest floor, endeavors that would have needed a great deal of expertise and funding. The flashlight beams revealed masonry of a professional caliber that was inconsistent with amateur building. This demonstrated that the person who constructed this entry had much experience in subterranean construction methods. State archaeological authorities got involved after receiving a call from Sheriff Williams to Michigan State University's Rebecca Martinez, one of the state's foremost authorities on historical archaeology and locations from the Prohibition-era. Dr. Martinez has written, knowledgeable about the McKinnon mythology, and was conversant with the historical data as well as the different hypotheses regarding the possible fate of the bootlegger who went missing. While she continued to use the proper caution regarding, she concurred that the discovery justified quick conclusions based on scant data, professional research, and made plans to send a small group of graduate students to the location the next day. Technical experts. Dr. Martinez's preliminary evaluation verified that in addition to being historically significant, the site could be hazardous to study without the right safety measures. Although it was obvious that the wooden door led to some sort of subterranean building, the state of the wooden components and the unreliability of the subterranean construction made it risky to undertake access without caution, structural assessment, and suitable safety gear. More significantly, the site matched the building methods and materials used in 1920 craftsmanship, historical narratives of McKinnon's actions that are quite accurate. In order to avoid unwanted access, she suggested that the site be locked right away and that as soon as possible, a thorough archaeological examination should be approved. The findings represented precisely the kind of discovery that could at last offer conclusive answers to queries that have perplexed historians for a century, but only if the inquiry was carried out in accordance with the proper professional norms and scientific integrity. The choice to move forward with a comprehensive excavation was created using emergency funds by local law enforcement and state historical preservation officials, supplied by special funding from the state budget for archaeology. Dr. Martinez was designated as the principal investigator, and she put together a multidisciplinary group of structural engineers who could assessing subterranean construction. Historical archaeologists have encountered, considering sites from the Prohibition era, and experts in industrial archaeology with prior site experience, connected to the production of illicit alcohol in the 1920s and 1930s. Officially, the probe started on October 30th, 2024, precisely 1 week and nearly exactly 100 years after the original discovery. Following McKinnon's unexplained disappearance, the timing appeared to be almost too ideal to be accidental, as though the forest had been holding out for this exact time to share the truths it had kept hidden for the whole century. The investigation's initial stage entailed meticulous excavation around the wooden door to ascertain the underground entrance system's size and structural state. Using hand tools and being cautious, using brushing methods to prevent harming delicate textiles, the group gradually revealed more of the entryway construction while using digital photography to capture every aspect and accurate measurements. They found that the wooden door was actually a sophisticated double-door security system's outer layer system with a second metal door around 6 feet below the ground floor. This internal door was in substantially better shape than the wooden outside structure, having been shielded from the components by the external barrier, constructed with strengthened hinges and a hefty steel plate. With what looked to be a sophisticated locking system, it had been made to resist weather damage and possible assaults by competing criminals or police enforcement. The locking mechanism contained what seemed to be an early combination mechanism in addition to traditional key locks, indicating that access had been tightly regulated, even among McKinnon's most reliable colleagues. Above all, the metal door had been. When it was eventually opened on November 5th, 2024, it was so successfully sealed against the elements that alcohol distillation-related smells were still present in the air that leaked from behind, would smoke almost a century after the business was shut down. These air traces preservation offered strong proof that the subterranean area had remained. Since McKinnon's time, it has been virtually sealed and unaltered. As soon as the metal door was, when it eventually opened and investigators entered the subterranean structure, they discovered themselves in a neatly built a route that surpassed their highest hopes for both sophistication and preservation. Beyond their LED's range, the main tube stretched in both directions. Flashlights with side tunnels that sometimes branch off toward various functioning regions of the intricate. The tunnel itself measured around 6 feet in height and 7 feet in width. Big enough to let supplies and equipment to be moved, but compact enough to reduce the structural difficulties associated with subterranean building given the local geology. The underground facility was remarkably preserved, considerably better than anyone could have imagined considering the environment and northern Michigan's geological conditions. The consistent temperature below, subterranean, and comparatively dry circumstances had shielded metal equipment, hardwood fixtures, and even some paper records from the deterioration that is often anticipated after so many years. In the primary storage spaces, numerous empty glass bottles with labels from the original timber crates were discovered by investigators. Distilleries that had been in operation throughout the period of Prohibition. The steel and copper distillation apparatus had obvious wear and tear, but was still in great structural shape, demonstrating both the caliber of the original investment made by McKinnon and the efficiency of the sealed underground preservation conditions. Surroundings. The finding offered previously unheard of tangible proof of a working bootlegging business during the Prohibition era, providing scholars with their first chance to examine such facilities using contemporary forensic and archaeological methods. As the inquiry, the study team realized the full extent of McKinnon's accomplishment over the ensuing weeks. The tunnel system was not as extensive as the most intricate stories had predicted, but was nevertheless astonishingly advanced for the period and situation, spanning many hundred yards in several directions and linking over a dozen distinct chambers that each had a distinct purpose during the bootlegging operation. There was top-notch copper equipment in the main distillation section, able to produce large amounts of alcohol, although storage spaces had been set up with the discovery of dwelling accommodations located deep under a commercial warehouse offered especially strong proof of the men's dedication and the complexity of the operation. There were sleeping quarters for multiple persons in the basement rooms, a community kitchen with period-appropriate appliances, and leisure spaces where employees might spend their restricted free time. Clothes, books, and other personal belongings were left behind when the location was abandoned. Correspondence and images that provide personal insights into the lives of the males who had made the decision to live and work in McKinnon's underground society. Probably most importantly, from a historical standpoint, detectives found what seemed to be McKinnon's personal office and planning center, including comprehensive tunnel system diagrams, financial documents outlining the extent of his activities, constant communication with distributors and suppliers across the region. These records offer the first tangible proof of the actual scope of his illegal company, as well as disclosed commercial connections and operational techniques that the initial investigators in the 1920s had never suspected. The tangible proof discovered in the subterranean facility at last offered conclusive responses to queries that had perplexed historians and investigators for a century, while concurrently boosting fresh and equally interesting queries regarding McKinnon's final destiny and the particular circumstances surrounding his disappearance precisely 100 years ago on that February night. The finding would not only alter Michigan's recognized history of bootlegging throughout the Prohibition era, but also offer vital hints on the true events of Red Tom McKinnon's last moments in the shadowy woodland before his permanent disappearance. From the live world, the methodical investigation and evaluation of McKinnon's subterranean facility during the winters of 2024 and 2025 exposed layers of intricacy and sophistication that disproved all preconceived notions about small-scale bootlegging enterprises during the Prohibition era. Dr. Martinez's multidisciplinary team meticulously recorded every chamber and hallway. They discovered proof of an operation that had operated with exceptional effectiveness and devotion to detail, proving that McKinnon had used the same professional standards to his illicit operations and methodical approach that might have been used in any respectable industrial project. The primary production site showed McKinnon's dedication to operational and quality management. efficiency within the limitations of his business, which had to be covert. The dominant copper still in the center. The distillation chamber was made by a reputable equipment supplier and was almost exactly the same as those utilized in pre-prohibition licensed distilleries. The still had technologies for monitoring temperature and pressure that enabled operators to keep exact control over the distillation procedure, guaranteeing constant quality and optimizing yield from the raw materials that are accessible. The ventilation system that provided support for the distillation operations were an incredible engineering achievement that had made it possible for the complicated to operate for years without being noticed. Despite the obvious fumes and smoke that come from making alcohol, a well-planned network of air shafts dispersed possibly damning materials while providing sufficient circulation. Emissions from a number of departure locations dispersed across the woodland above. The system had simple yet efficient filtration that lessened smells and prevented the visible emissions that may have attracted notice from aircraft or ground patrols. The complex's inventory control and storage demonstrated McKinnon's expertise in industrial engineering and his methodical approach to running a firm. Completed goods were arranged in distinct rooms based on the kind, degree of quality, and final destination, using a monitoring and labeling system that made it possible for employees to find particular products swiftly while keeping precise records of distribution plans and inventory levels. The storage spaces with dedicated divisions for finished goods, products in different phases of production, and raw materials, awaiting delivery, as well as return goods that needed to be reworked or tested for quality. The identification of substantial. McKinnon's personal office's business records provide previously unheard-of insights into the financial and operational facets of his illegal business. Comprehensive financial documents revealed monthly sales that frequently surpassed those of respectable local companies, with profit margins that showed both the superior quality of his goods and the hefty prices they fetched on the illicit alcohol market. The documents additionally demonstrated the high expenses associated with running such a business, including expenditures for raw supplies, equipment upkeep, safety precautions, and payment for employees and colleagues. Lists of customers and communication files demonstrated the intricate web of business connections McKinnon had built around the region. Speak Easy and exclusive clubs throughout several states were among his clientele, demonstrating that his distribution network had spread well beyond the immediate neighborhood. Letters from vendors demonstrated that he had built connections with respectable companies that supplied both raw materials and completed goods for resale, frequently hiding them with complex cover stories. The actual character of his actions. Conversations with other criminals. According to groups, McKinnon's operation was a part of a far bigger and more intricate network of illicit actions that were not previously suspected. Coordination was suggested using coded signals, cooperative security, pooled transportation resources, and other bootleggers in various areas. Agreements intended to protect one another from rival criminal organizations and law enforcement. The complexity of these commercial connections showed how bootlegging had changed since the Prohibition era, become a type of organized crime that followed many of the same rules as respectable companies. Businesses. The complex's personnel records had comprehensive information regarding the histories, specialized skills, and pay of the guys who had worked for McKinnon. Arrangements. According to the records, he had employed around 20 persons at different points in time, ranging from skilled distillers, equipment operators, security guards, and common workers. According to salary documents, he had paid his employees much more than they could have made in illegal employment, guaranteeing their allegiance while making up for the significant risks associated with illicit activity. The complex's security measures showed McKinnon's keen awareness of the ongoing risks associated with his chosen line of work. Several evacuation routes offered substitutes in case the primary. There were passageways that stretched several hundred yards from the core facilities toward the compromised entrance. Various parts of the forest Lookout posts were connected to the underground complex via a communication system. On the surface, enabling communication with security staff without requiring risky in-person contacts that may have been noticed by competing criminals or law enforcement. Guns were kept in weapon storage facilities and ammunition adequate to protect the complex from possible assaults whilst supplying the tools for offensive operations in case the situation called for it. Among the weapons were both longer-range rifles that could be utilized for perimeter security and handguns appropriate for personal defense. More forceful defensive actions. The gun's quantity and caliber suggested that McKinnon had been ready for a major military confrontation in the event that his mission was attacked. The complex's living rooms revealed a moving tale of guys who had opted to live completely underground rather than regular travel between their houses in the open world, and the underground facility exposes them to risk. These, in addition to sleeping quarters and rudimentary culinary amenities, as well as leisure areas where employees might spend their little free time. Personal belongings abandoned when there were games, musical instruments, literature, and other items on the abandoned site. Images that offered insights into the humanity of those who had been eager to serve McKinnon's business by living underground. Among the most important, McKinnon had created a thorough emergency plan for leaving the compound if the situation necessitated an emergency evacuation. The proposal contained comprehensive protocols for discarding confidential papers, turning off or removing expensive equipment to stop their use by others, and closing up the different entrances to hide proof of the operation from possible law enforcement detection. Caches of emergency supplies, dispersed across the complex, could have supported a few workers for a few weeks if they had been compelled to stay underground till external threats have passed. Additionally, the emergency plan disclosed that McKinnon had set up several safe havens and escape routes in case his scheme was uncovered or if he personally faced direct threats from competing criminals or legal enforcement. Allusions to transportation, plans, relationships in other areas, and concealed financial resources indicated that he had been ready to, if conditions forced him to continue operating in Michigan, he would quickly leave and relocate. Impossible. Concerning doubts were raised by the existence of these thorough preparations regarding why, in light of the security concerns, he had not put them into practice on the night of his disappearance. It had been bothering him in the last few weeks of his surgery. Examination of the complex's evidence. Important information about the events behind McKinnon's disappearance and the swift desertion of the establishment. Evidence demonstrated that the emergency protocols had been partially executed with some private documents destroyed and priceless equipment ready for transfer. However, it was obvious that the process had been stopped before it was finished. This pattern implied that whatever occurred to McKinnon had happened abruptly and without enough notice for his associates to finish their intended evacuation protocols. The partial execution of evacuation protocols showed that McKinnon's organization had started taking the necessary precautions after realizing the immediate danger measures, but had not had enough time to adequately address the threat that had emerged. The evacuation's incompleteness indicated that either the threat had grown more quickly than expected or that McKinnon was the specific target of the threat rather than the program as a whole. The finding of McKinnon's personal belongings in his underground workspace offered the most poignant proof of his final days and how abruptly he vanished. His desk was filled with incomplete correspondence, such as a partially composed letter alerting a colleague to heightened legal enforcement operations in the region and talking about backup plans that must be put into practice. Personal belongings like his reading and pocket watch, glasses, and a picture of an unknown woman were still precisely where he had left them, as if he had merely took a brief break with the full intention of coming back to finish his task. The evidence's forensic examination from the complex would eventually offer fresh perspectives on McKinnon's destiny and assist in addressing concerns regarding the circumstances of his disappearance, which had baffled detectives for precisely a century. However, knowledge of the Prohibition era had already been completely transformed by the uncovering of his clandestine enterprise. Bootlegging activities and proved that Red Tom McKinnon's accomplishments had exceeded even his most extravagant stories by a wide margin. The intelligent. One of the most remarkable instances of organized crime was a criminal operation concealed beneath the Michigan forest. Illicit conduct in American history. An example of the creativity, ambition, resolve of a man who had defied federal authority with previously unheard-of audacity and competence, only to abruptly disappear at the pinnacle of his glory and leave a mystery that would last for precisely 100 years.